Good afternoon, everyone. This is Steve Lyles from the Kentucky Department of Education on this August 26th, 2021. And we have some news to provide to you on our webinar. It's different news than usual. It's not all financial, but it does fall into your realm because it deals with quarantines and closures and some things that maybe you're not used to dealing with, but we think it is helpful information. So um, first, we want to kick it off with Ms. Robin Kinney, who does have a little bit of financial information to provide to you, as well as some just some news that may be relevant to you.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to just kick us off with a few comments. First, a thank you to all of our local school district finance officers, superintendents, and others that may have joined us for today's meeting. We know you are working really hard right now. The challenges as we start this new school year, we're in a place, again, we say it every time, it's sort of a place that we're not familiar with, and it's creating challenges that are very difficult for school district operations. So first, a thank you to you for all that you do on behalf of your local school districts, your students, your staff, and your communities. And I also want to say a thank you to the team here at KDE who is working really hard right now on your behalf. Lots of folks across the Department of Education every day trying to listen and learn from our local school district partners in our efforts to try to improve or mitigate or just give opportunities and options for you to consider. We know that things have been incredibly difficult as you start the new school year. You know, we are monitoring and watching and talking to lots of superintendents about what is happening in your local communities. We've talked with lots and lots of superintendents about the challenges that are faced. So what we're going to do today, Steve is right, some of this is not purely financial, but a lot of it does have a financial impact potentially. And so we want to talk about some things that have been happening here at the Department of Education, as well as remind you of some options that are already available for your local school district. This is not to say that all of these will be a good fit for whatever your particular challenge or situation right now, but you know, it's really to help you identify what is out there, make sure that you are mindful of those things, and then as you work as a leader in your school district, you can help with those very difficult decisions that are being made. We are going to talk about things that affect attendance. If you'll remember, just starting with this new school year, attendance and the goal of in-person attendance is really everyone's goal. If you can reflect back to last year, ADA funding, and for the current school year that we're in right now, funding is already kind of determined. But we know that as we start taking attendance and deal with attendance for this school year, it impacts the next year's funding. You know, we're talking about SEEK, we're always looking a year backwards. So some of the things that we're going to talk about today, and we have heard some of the concerns are about low attendance or impacts to attendance. So we're going to talk about some of the things surrounding that, some of your current options that are available, and really what happens if you pursue some of these options. It is the goal of everyone to have that in-person attendance, but we do have some hurdles that we have to overcome. So what options are now available? And we'll talk about some of these today as you're thinking about, you know, the flexibility that districts need. We just issued this morning some guidance on performance-based learning. That's something that's already in place, already as an exception to that in-person attendance requirement under state law. So there's some guidance that has been issued today. I just want to make you generally aware of that. That was sent to your superintendents. You may be familiar that the Kentucky Board of Education accepted waivers from school districts in the summertime, earlier this summer, about virtual academies. So that's another way that you can operate in a more remote fashion for some of your student population. We're going to talk today about quarantine leave for staff and quarantine impact on attendance for students. Again, really trying to push the flexibility of being able to continue to deliver instruction to your students recognizing that they need to be out of your buildings for quarantine, but also allowing them to still be included in AADA. NTI is a very familiar acronym for lots of you, non-traditional instruction. That's still in place, but remember, right now we only have the ability for districts to use that for 10 days this school year. So we've heard some concerns about that. And then finally, we have issued some guidance. I think it went out this week on school closures. And while we never want to, you know, that has to be a last option. We provide that and guidance around that because your first and foremost priority needs to be the safety of your students and your staff. So trying to just inform you about all the things that are out there. These are mitigation tools, just like the mitigation tools that we think about when we're talking about sanitizing and mask wearing and cleaning and all those other mitigation tools. I just want to kind of set that stage for you so you'll understand kind of the context in which this webcast is being delivered, and also to invite you to send to us as at the Department of Education sort of your particular facts and circumstances that you are being challenged with. We can't possibly walk a day in your shoes at the local level, but we are certainly here to listen and to learn and try to think of ways that from a statewide perspective we can address challenges. I would share with you that there are some things that the department as a state agency can try to assist and approve, but of course we can't solve all. So for example, we are back under the attendance model, and we no longer have the ability at the Department of Education to kind of freeze that ADA at the 1819 or 1920 level that we've had in the past. That would have to be something that is done by legislative action. So, but please, please send us all your kind of thoughts, comments, suggestions, so that we can consider the things that we can do here at the Department of Education, and we will certainly try to move those forward. I'm going to now turn it over to Steve. I'm going to stay on the call so I can listen to your questions and also the comments that are received. Steve, let's go ahead and kick off with the information that you have to share with the group.
All right. If we move over, I guess, to slide number 4. Okay, and before we get started here, for those of you who may be a little unfamiliar or just need a rehash on asking questions or reviewing the questions that have been asked, on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a little icon at the top there that shows a little question mark. That's where you can ask questions. And if you would please, in the part of the box there on the bottom right-hand side, I think it starts there as anonymous. If you would type in your name there so that we can know who's asking the question, so that if possible, if we need to specifically refer to you by name in a response, maybe outside of this webcast, we can do so, so that we know who's asking the question and we can respond to you maybe in a more specific way than just through this call. So that's how you can ask questions of us, and we can answer those later on here in just a bit. So let me take a quick drink. But as Robin mentioned, you know, just a few weeks ago, we thought, probably most of us thought that we were going to start this school year and more in a more normal fashion. But here we are, and so the State Board of Education recently met and created some guidelines, some emergency regulations for us to go by, so that we can get through this school year with some regulations with dismissing school, quarantining employees, quarantining students, if need be. And so here we go, and I'm going to go over the piece with quarantining employees, and Jesse Carlton is going to go over the part with students. And so with quarantining employees, that's under 702 KAR 191E, and which stands for emergency. And so how do we determine if you need to quarantine an employee? Well, there's 4 different avenues in determining that. And so that can be determined by a health professional, you know, so a local doctor can determine that. A local health department can determine that if an employee goes there and the health department says the employee needs to be quarantined. The State Department of Health can determine that, or you as a district can determine they need to be quarantined. So those are the four entities that can determine whether the employee needs to be quarantined. And so if that's the case, then they may be eligible to be for this special leave. So the employee next needs to be vaccinated in order to apply, or in order to be eligible for this exemption as well. So that's bullet number 2. And then also, documentation will need to be required. So if the employee gets it from an outside source, you as a district may say, well, I need you to get a doctor's note, or I need you to get the note from the local health department to tell us that you need to be quarantined. So that's also maybe necessary. But you as a district, if you say the employee from the district side needs to be quarantined, then you need to provide the employee that documentation as well. So that's in the third bullet. All right, let's go on to the next one. Okay. But here's a caveat for employees. If they do test positive for COVID, they are not eligible for this leave. In that case, they will need to use their sick leave or other options that may be available in your district to those employees. And so if you will look there on the first bullet, if they test positive, they will need to use emergency leave or some other sick leave that is available due to positive COVID tests. So that needs to be taken into consideration as well. And then the second bullet talks about, and this is only available to the actual district employee. It's not due to an employee member or somebody who's related to the employee. This is only available, this quarantine leave is only available to the employee themselves. So that's something else to keep in mind. And then the third bullet is talking about if the district wants to make it a shorter leave, you may require the employee to get it tested in accordance with the CDC guidance. And we have a flow chart that I'm going to show you a little bit later that can help you determine what that is. But you can possibly have a shorter quarantine time based on CDC guidance. All right, let's move on to the next one. Now, here's another thing. If the employee is able to perform their duties in a remote fashion, then this leave may not be available as well. So that's something else to consider. And also, this leave is only available, this emergency regulation is only available this school year, the 21-22 school year. And, excuse me, it does not carry forward to next school year, and it's not transferable to another employee or another time. And the last bullet, another thing to keep in mind is, yes, this is the money, kind of the money piece of it, is the pandemic relief, the ESSER monies can be used to offset the cost of this. So that's something to keep in mind is, if you're worried about how you're going to pay for this, the ESSER funds can be used to help to pay for this kind of leave, the quarantine leave. All right, next one. So within KDE, we've created this flow chart, and there's another one in a minute, but this one is kind of a walkthrough step-by-step on if an employee can be eligible for this quarantine leave. And I'm going to send these out so that, obviously these flow charts, these PowerPoint snippets are a little bit condensed and small and hard to look at, but I will send these out where they're a full page so you can look at them a little bit easier, but I will walk through what each of these say. So did the employee test positive for COVID? So that's the first thing you want to look at. So if it's yes, they're automatically ineligible. The next one, can employee perform their duties remotely? If it's yes, then they're ineligible. So then you want to go, if those first two are no, then they're ineligible. They're ineligible. So then you want to go to the third one. Is it a family member? They're ineligible. But if it's not, you want to look and see if were they quarantined by a medical professional, local health department, DPH, or the school district. And if it's yes, you can keep going. Were they fully vaccinated? Yes, then you can keep going. Was the documentation provided by the health professional or DPH? And yes, then you go to the bottom right, they are eligible, and if not, they're not eligible. So this is kind of a simple flow chart that you all can use to find out if people are eligible for the leave. You know, let us know if this is helpful or useful, and we can tweak it if necessary, but we think this will be beneficial for you all. All right, let's go to the next one. And this one is actually created by Department of Public Health, and using in a little more detail once you find out if they are needing to be quarantined. So you start at the top there, and I'm not going to go into the details on this, but you can use this, and I'll also send this one out as well. But you can look at this to see, step by step, if they're in proximity with one another, how many days they were exposed, and that kind of thing, on who needs and who does not need to be quarantined. So this is also a very useful flow chart to look at. And let's go to the next one. And that's what I have. And so do we want to go with questions on this, or do we want to wait to get all questions at the end? Does anybody, let's just say, are there any questions on the quarantine up to this point?
Yes, we have 2 questions as of right now. The first one that we have is, we had an employee to be quarantined by the local health department, and the next day this person was vaccinated, and now they're asking to be covered until the paid leave provisions. Are there any exceptions to the date of vaccination?
Well, I would say, so I'm guessing they got vaccinated after they were quarantined. So I don't think the vaccinations are fully realized, I guess you might say, until a couple weeks. Wouldn't you say, Robin? In most cases?
I was pulling the language. And I'm going to look for this so I can cite the exact language to you. But you must have been fully vaccinated before the quarantine period in order to access the leave. So it is possible that later on, so for this first quarantine period for this specific instance, this leave would not be eligible to that employee. However, we want to keep encouraging vaccinations. So continue to encourage that vaccination. If, unfortunately, that there is a second and subsequent quarantine that needs to happen and they are fully vaccinated, they would be able to access this leave. But you need to be fully vaccinated or have one of the exceptions prior to your quarantine in order to access this leave. There may be other leave available at the district for this employee, just not this specific leave.
Very good. All right, Josh, next one.
The next one is, sorry, they moved. I see an exemption from vaccination is listed. Can you elaborate?
The main exemption is for extreme religious belief. So that is the only one that I'm aware of. Is that right, Robin?
Steve, let me kind of clarify that. And if you look at the emergency regulation, we do have some people that cannot take the vaccination due to a prior disability or prior health condition. And if they have a note from a doctor that identifies that, then that is an exemption. And then if they are required to be quarantined and have that, then they would have access to this leave. The other exemption that is cited specifically in the regulation is for a sincerely held religious belief. And so if you have someone that is expressing to you that they have a sincere religious belief that says that they cannot be vaccinated, then that could be an exception and they would be eligible to access this leave.
Very good, thank you.
Is the quarantine only a one-time use?
No, it's not. You can actually be quarantined more than once. So you may have a quarantine period where the local health department says that you need to be quarantined for, I'm going to make up days, 10 days. You could actually serve your quarantine period. Of course, the district could ask you to test earlier than that in efforts to bring you back earlier. You complete your quarantine, you come back, and you're working, and let's say a month from now, and gosh, I hope we're not still dealing with this a month from now, but it is possible. A month from now, you need to quarantine again. And this quarantine relief, this quarantine leave is available to all full and part-time employees for the entire school year.
Are we required to provide quarantine leave to an employee that qualifies, or is this an option?
Quarantine leave is not an option. It is available to all full and part-time employees in all of our school districts, so long as they meet the quarantine determination requirements and the eligibility requirements.
And the last one for right now, how do we document a religious exemption?
You can ask for your employee to provide that either in an affidavit or a note to you. That is the best way, is to provide it in a written documentation.
And I think that's it for right now.
All right. We'll move on to school closures with Jesse Carlton.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to talk about a few things that normally may not be in your all's realm as finance officers, and we may, normally be talking to DPPs or superintendents about some of these things, but because they are going to impact ADA and funding, ADA translates into funding for you guys, we're going to kind of give you an overview of what is available right now. So everything we're going to talk about here in the next few minutes are options that are available to school districts right now for closing school or district, and how you track those kids who may be quarantined or isolated within your system, and how that affects ADA and funding. So right here, we're going to start out talking about this closing schools. The board and the Department of Education have recommended several different mitigation strategies. One of which is the emergency regulation that requires the use of face masks by students. There's a link there in case you all need that. Kind of the main point that we're going to keep harping on as we go through here is right now, currently, a school cannot close to in-person instruction and transfer all their students to virtual instruction. There is no statute or regulation right now that we have that allows all students to be transferred into a virtual instruction model and average daily attendance, and therefore funding, to be generated from students being instructed virtually. So there are a couple of options of how to have groups of students, and we'll talk about those, but that's kind of main point right now. Even with cases spiking and everything, that we have no option right now to move all children into a virtual setting unless the entire district does it. So right there is a link to school closure guidance. It can be found on our website, I'm sure, by just Googling school closure. And we will be sending these slides out right after this presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so closing a specific school in the district. This has been bubbling up to KDE quite a bit in the last few weeks. People are seeing pockets of positive cases and lots of quarantines, either with students, or we've seen lots of people asking about high numbers of quarantines with teachers that are saying, hey, I need to just maybe possibly close one school. So right now, as in years past, there is an option for closing a school or even part of the district, maybe one or two schools. Just to be clear here, we're not talking about the entire district. We're talking about one or two schools in the district. This was on the books, and some people may have used it in the past, an emergency day, if there was a water main break or electricity was out or something happened that you needed to shut a school for a day or 1 or 2 days. Now, it's very important to note that if you close a school, there will be no ADA and therefore no funding for that day. There's nothing generated on that day because there's no instruction taking place. Now, if you close the school, you can request a waiver from the commissioner, and if that is granted, that means that that day's the day and hours that are required for the year. You know, you have to have 170 days, 1,062 hours of instruction in a school year. Those days and hours can be waived, but those days will not generate ADA or funding. The only way to generate ADA or funding is to make that day up at the end of the school year or sometime else during the calendar. All right, next slide. Okay, now we're talking about closing the entire district. If you need to close the entire district, all the schools in your district, NTI, non-instructional days are available to you again this year. They're available for 10 days in the school year. Once again, the entire district is closed and everyone is moved during those 10 days to virtual learning, following the continuation of learning plan that has been received that you use to apply for these days with our Office of Continuous Improvement and Support. Once again, this impacts all schools and it cannot be used on a school by school basis. So you can't have NTI at one school and not the other ones. All schools in the district have to be on using an NTI day together. All right, next slide.
Hey, Jesse,
Yeah.
Before you proceed, can you go back to that last slide for just a second? You know, it's interesting how my language has changed a little bit as we talk about school closures and we talk about NTI. You know, closures to us used to mean not in the school building. And so really non-traditional instruction, we are still delivering instruction in that manner. So I like to think of NTI more like we're moving to a different mode of instruction rather than really closing. We're not really closing because there is still a way for funding to be generated on NTI days. So I'm trying to teach myself not to say closure as much when I talk about NTI. It really is just moving that instruction mode off to another location. But as Jesse has suggested, it is for the entire district. It can't be used on a school by school or a grade or a classroom or anything like that. It has to be used for the entire district. And we do know and appreciate that districts are very cautious about utilizing your NTI days because right now there's only 10 of them. So we do see that as a challenge for you all as you make decisions about when to use those and are trying to hear from districts about the challenges that those 10 days creates. At this time, we don't believe that the Department of Education has the ability to grant more than that. So it is important that we hear from you if your problem is more district-wide and moving to a mode of learning for all your students, or if it is in just pockets where you're talking about a school, a grade, a classroom, something like that. It's important for us to hear from you on that topic. Thank you, Jesse.
Thanks, Robin. All right, let's hop to the next slide if we can. I think we're going to transition into talking about individual students and student attendance. Yes, next slide. Okay, so there was an emergency regulation that we have put in place to be able to count that ADA for a student who may be quarantined or isolated, but is still receiving services. So we know lots of districts have had to quarantine students and students are testing positive and they're also isolated and they're not able to come into school. So what we have done is we have created a code to be able to track these students. It is important if you're on that side of the house and deal with anything in Infinite Campus also. Just wanted to get a little plug in here. You not only need to code these students like we're going to talk about on the next slide, you also need to make sure they are in an attendance group that notes whether they are quarantined due to exposure or if they're quarantined because they were COVID positive, because those numbers are still going to help us at a state level be able to pull and tell how many kiddos are out of the building either due to exposure or because they're positive. Okay, let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about this code. Okay, so we have created a code that can go on a student's attendance record that's called Quarantined Receiving Services. And when I say we've created it, we have actually given districts the ability to create it. It is an exempt code, and there are very few and far between, because what an exempt code does is it says that no matter, even if the student is marked absent, this is an absent exempt code. The student is not in the building, but exempt means that you will generate funding for the student, because your options, you can be marked absent or present, and then your excuses are either excused, unexcused, or exempt. An excused and an unexcused code, excused and unexcused, does not generate funding, but an exempt code will generate funding for that student. So to use this code, the student needs to be coded with this QRS code, but the student also must be receiving daily instruction. Okay, that doesn't mean that that's 100% synchronous instruction, but there is some type of interaction with the teacher during the quarantine period. We kind of lay out there what instruction needs to look like according to KRS 158060. And there's specific guidance that you can kind of point your instruction side back to when interacting with these students. But what we wanted to make sure you guys knew on your end is that students who are quarantined with this code, they will generate half day or whole day attendance in the system, which is then rolled into average daily attendance if this code is being used. It is also the district's decision that if a student who is isolated because they are positive for COVID, they may, instead of using this code, they could be entered into your home hospital instruction at your school or at your district. Now, all of the same paperwork and everything you have to do for home hospital is still in effect there, so you'd still have to fill out the paperwork, go through either the home hospital committee or the ARC committee. All of that should still be followed. But if they are well enough and you don't want to go down that home hospital path, isolated and quarantined students can use that QRS code that is absent exempt and generates ADA. Next slide, please. Oh, that was quicker than I thought. I think we are to the question stage. Anybody on the KDE side want to hop in with anything else before we run into questions? All right, I'll take that as a no. Josh, I'm sure we still have some questions out there, don't we?
Yes, we have one on your side so far.
Okay.
Since ADA is an average, an individual school closure will keep that day's attendance from being included in the average calculation, or that day will be a zero in the average calculation.
That day will not be included in the average calculation. It will not go in as zero because there's no attendance taken that day. Now, remember, we do know that, if you have, normally 170 days and you start getting days that are waived because a school is closed, your number of days is going to decrease. Therefore, if you have fewer days, it will impact your, ADA a little bit because you're going to have fewer days in your denominator to divide by. So it's kind of important to make that distinction to say, yes, if a school is closed and, if you make up that day, then you'll have the day back in your ADA. But if you choose to request a waiver for that day, the number of days for your school year is going to decrease, and that in turn will affect your ADA.
All right, that's all we have on school closures.
Okay. I'm going to go back. I think maybe, are we going back to more questions about the leave time?
We have a couple more of those if you want to go ahead and do those.
Okay, I think I'm at the end here. Steve, Robin, you ready to head back to questions on that side of the fence?
Okay.
All right.
Just to make sure I understand, there is no limit on number of days a staff member could use under the quarantine leave during the school year. For example, if they are quarantined 5 times, they could use up to 50 days of leave.
They could. Theoretically, that's possible, but they have to be quarantined first by one of those entities, the local health department, the Department for Public Health, a treating physician, or the school, the employing school district. So while that is possible, the short answer is there is not a cap or limit on the number of quarantine leave days.
Okay. How would someone be required to quarantine if they are vaccinated and cannot test positive?
I'm not sure about what the cannot test positive, but I think the question raises an important point for us to say. Currently, right now, under the CDC guidance, if you are fully vaccinated, you do not have to be quarantined. So local health departments, public health, treating physicians, and your local school district may choose not to quarantine a fully vaccinated person. But there still may be some instances where that may make sense to do so. Let me give an example. Let's say you are a local public school district and you have a teacher in a classroom, and he or she has been exposed because 4 of the students in that classroom have tested positive. And that teacher has been in close proximity with those students for the more than 15 minutes a day. So you still may want to allow that employee to quarantine, get them out of the building, and allow them to go get tested out of an abundance of caution. Because remember, the whole point of this in quarantining is to help mitigate the spread. So even though right now a fully vaccinated person does not have to be quarantined, as long as they are not showing any symptoms, so they are asymptomatic, they feel good, they can still come to work, you still may choose, based upon the facts and circumstances of how they have been exposed, you still may choose to quarantine them. So I hope that helps. It was a really good point of the person who asked that question, to ask about the fully vaccinated person.
All right. An employee gets quarantined 10 times this year because they will not follow the guidance. Will we have to pay them each time?
I'm not sure what it means by they would not follow the guidance. If you could kind of put in some additional facts around that, they would not follow the guidance. Remember, you have to be fully vaccinated in order to access this leave in the first place, or under one of the 2 exemptions.
Okay. Would the superintendent/designee be who accepts or rejects religious exemptions in the district? If so, any guidance on what would qualify as a religious exemption?
Yeah, so I'm going to be really careful with the religious exemption, simply because our legal office tells us to do so, and probably your local board council would say the same. When you get one on religious exemptions, you really need to include your local board council in those discussions if you feel, because it does talk about sincerely held religious belief. And that language actually comes from some of the CDC guidance as well, so that wasn't something really that we just inserted here at KDE. We are relying again upon those health experts. So I would reach out, if I got one of those, I would certainly reach out to my local board council for analysis of the exemption.
I think that's it for right now. Yes.
So if we're out of questions, if I could invite people to put into the chat some of the challenges that you see and you are experiencing at your district level for really just continuing your operations. We said in the presentation, one of the holes that we see right now is this inability of districts to be able to move to remote learning or even a hybrid option for certain pockets of either quarantine or isolation in your districts. So we have identified that, at least just from talking with our local school districts, that might be one point that we want to try to address, either here at KDE or through the help of others that may be able to help us with that. So I am interested in hearing through the chat feature if people could put their thoughts about that. Would that be helpful for your local school district? And then also your thoughts about going back to the 1819, 1920 freezing of ADA. Would that be helpful? Would that not be helpful? Again, I've said I don't think we have the ability to do that, but really conversations and information shared by our local school districts really help us to know what to advocate on your behalf. So hoping that some people could put some comments in the chat on either one of those topics or anything else that you'd like to share.
I do have more questions coming in. Are you saying if a person tests positive and has no symptoms, do you do not have to quarantine them at all?
No. So if someone tests positive, then they have tested positive. Most of the things we're talking about are quarantine with full vaccination. So that's the leave category we're talking about. We're not talking about someone who tests positive. You should follow the CDC guidance. Again, they will have to be quarantined, but they are not eligible to access this particular leave that we're talking about today, which is the quarantine leave. So I apologize if I caused some confusion on that. But if you test positive, you still have to quarantine. You just can't access this leave. You can access any other eligible leave that's available at your district.
The current CDC guidelines is wearing a mask even if you are vaccinated and to social distance indoors. So if they are refusing to do so, they are not following the guidance. I think that was
Okay.
part of that, going back to that last question.
Okay, thank you very much for the person sharing with that. Right now, under the emergency regulation for universal masks, your district should be taking appropriate action against employees that are not wearing masks in your district buildings. So let me say that first. So we have referred districts to consider actions under employee code of conduct and your employee handbooks, policies, where employees are not following basically the emergency regulation, which has the full force and effect of law right now. So as districts, you should be taking action against those staff in that manner, which would then alleviate the concern that it sounds like someone has where someone's coming into the building and then needs to be quarantined.
Okay. We are struggling with bus drivers and our entire bus routes being quarantined. We do not have enough transportation for students for school, which also impacts transportation funding. I think that's just part of those questions you were asking them.
Yeah, thank you so much for that comment. We have recognized that we are, before we were already challenged with bus driver shortages. So we do appreciate the struggles that districts are having right now with just the ability to provide adequate transportation. We have seen some of our districts have had to cancel some routes, and we know that's really, really difficult for operations in a local school district. And I think the comment is that, of course, when those buses are not rolling and they are not transporting children on a day-to-day basis, of course, that impacts the ability to have those kids there for instruction and creates chaos during the day, but it also does impact your funding. So thank you very much for that comment. That is another one that is kind of on our radar right now.
And then we just have a bunch of comments saying that they are in favor of freezing the 1819.
Okay. And again, KDE doesn't really have that authority independently to do that, but it's always helpful to know if districts think that would be a good, especially from the finance officers, the folks that deal with the money on a day-to-day basis, if that would be helpful for your districts.
That's about all I'm seeing right now.
I see Che has popped up on the screen. Che, do you have additional comments?
Yes, I woke up. Thank you. I was reading through some of the comments, and I do note one of them is a growth district, and I don't need to call them out, but they're obviously concerned because they might miss that growth window with their students they picked up, as well as assessments that have grown very fast, which obviously can hit districts pretty hard too. So that's just something that we'll take into consideration if we're asked by obviously General Assembly or the governor's office about options. And every day, especially on the transportation issue that someone put in the chat window, that was way back. Sorry, I'm catching up. That's something we're kind of hyper aware of right now. We see it in the news, obviously, but we received a ton of phone calls from angry parents about routes being canceled and rearrangements and stuff like that. So we're very aware of that. So we appreciate your transportation directors trying to do their best with what they have, and trying to juggle all these things at once. It's just really an impossible task. So, but like Robin said, we're already talking probably every minute of every day about what could happen in the near future. Obviously, we want to be optimistic, but if things do go south, we want to be prepared to make sure you guys can continue operations and stuff like that. We know the 1819 is good for a lot of districts, but also it can harm some districts that are growing. So we got to keep that in our mind too when we're talking about it. And thanks for all your comments. We do appreciate it.
I think we may have found a question or two that got slipped in and slipped past us. If do we have enough time to go back and ask one or two more?
Yeah,
Sure,
I
we've
think we're
got a couple
okay.
minutes.
Okay. All right. And as soon as I said that, the screen moved. Do you have one, Josh?
I doubt mine. I had it, and then
Okay, here we go. One question is, what if the exposure comes from an outside source other than the school setting? And I think they're asking if you can still use the leave, and I think the answer is yes, because somebody else can, the health department or a doctor can quarantine somebody, correct?
Mm-hmm.
That is correct. Unlike what we may have seen previously, it is not specifically tied, because I think what districts may be thinking about as they were reporting to the Department for Public Health last year, there was a distinction in your reporting requirements that it was tied to reporting only those ones that happened within your school. So as an incident there, this quarantine employee leave does not make that distinction. So it is available no matter how they are exposed if they need to be quarantined by one of those quarantine entities.
Right. And the last one I see here, it may be get down too far in the weeds and we may need to reach back out to this person. Says, what would happen if someone with natural immunity with antibodies above levels of vaccination becomes exposed to a positive person? I believe they're asking if quarantine still applies to them if they're not vaccinated, which I would believe say would be yes, correct?
So I think we would ask that question of our friends at the Department for Public Health just to make sure. We rely very, very much on our friends at Public Health to be sort of the experts on when and how to quarantine. That's why we tried to put that kind of chart in today's presentation, and then we pass that information along. But we can certainly ask that question of the Department for Public Health and get an answer back to the requester.
And I think that requester actually had put in as anonymous, so just so we can get an answer back to you, if you'd want to throw another comment in there and say that was me,
Yeah.
that'd be helpful. Josh, I'm not seeing any others. You?
I don't either.
I've got one question almost toward the bottom about ADA or kindergarten rather. Sorry, it said if we do the 1819, so that full day kindergarten would still be up to the General Assembly because our last the 140 million we got was 1 year, which we were very happy to obviously get, but we will approach that with them again in this next budget. And if they say okay, stick with 1819. If they will fully fund kindergarten, we'll use the same kindergarten numbers for that. So we obviously have pushed for that for a long time, and we'll continue to push for that. It's a significant amount of money for districts. So
yes, that is under consideration right now. Department staff are advocating for that to be included in the upcoming biennial budget request. The Kentucky Board of Education will actually approve our budget submission at the October meeting. So we got a little more time, but full day kindergarten certainly is on our list to advocate for.
I do have another one that's came in at the bottom. What if an employee self-quarantines based on symptoms they have? Can they use the emergency day leaves?
So since an individual employee is not one of the 4 eligible entities that can determine the quarantine, it would not allow if someone just independently says, I need to be quarantined, that does not trigger this leave. They may have the ability to access other leave at your district, but it doesn't access this quarantine leave because they're not one of the 4 eligible entities. Do we have any other questions, Josh?
I see some more comments about, sorry, I'm scrolling back here, about subs, having difficulty finding subs. And there was one here about very concerned about our ability to keep employees with all the pay increases happening around the district. It's very difficult for them to keep these folks at the district. She says cannot keep classified and cannot find substitutes. So substitutes are a problem as well. So.
Thank you for sharing that. I think really, of course, we feel that so strongly in the education community, not having access to all the folks we really need to make our school operations go. And we also see that really in other parts of business and industry. We see lots of struggles in trying to find adequate staffing at our grocery stores and restaurants and everywhere. It seems like everyone's really having a challenge with it, but we do understand and appreciate how difficult it is to really run your operations smoothly and provide that quality instruction if you're shorthanded and always wondering how many bodies you're going to have there to provide these services in the first place. It's a very, very challenging place for school districts to be.
All right, we have another one that's coming in. Can we use the ARP ESSER to supplement any possible loss in SEEK if we do not get a frozen ADA from 1819?
We'll have to research that one. We did that early on, so I'm hesitant to give an answer. I know that the ARP ESSER and the ESSER funds were not originally intended to basically take care of shortages in state funding formulas. But I will share with you that there's ongoing conversations all the time. And if we look at our nation as a whole and what's happening and the impact really that the Delta variant is making on education communities and funding overall, we're just trying to keep a really close ear to conversations that are happening because things are continuing to evolve. But I know originally that really wasn't the intention of the use of ESSER funds. So we'll pose that question and see if we hear anything about it.
This was kind of on the same line. It's thought, is there a thought that we may have to move our SEEK dollars to ESSER at the end of the calendar year?
I'm sorry, I'm not following that question. Is anybody else? Shay, do you understand?
I think maybe they've just kind of said it backwards.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm
think
reading
they're asking
that the
to
other
use
way around.
ESSER. I think they're reading it the same way as the previous question. They came in about the same time.
Okay.
That's all the questions I see. Jesse, do you see any more?
No,
I think that's all we got.
That's all I see. And thanks everybody for your, not your questions, but just giving us some feedback. This is really important to us. We appreciate it. And we'll take all this back and hopefully, have some more clarity in the next couple of weeks for everybody as things kind of unfurl in front of us. So.
And I've already sent out the PowerPoints and the materials to everyone through an email. So please pass those along to anybody who may use those in your district as well, besides just yourself.
And just also as our next superintendent's webcast for which we share additional information on each one of those is currently scheduled for September 14th. So what we try to do is we try to have a superintendent's webcast and then share with finance officers following that. So that is the next tentative date, September 14th for superintendent webcast. Thank you all again for your participation today, taking time out of your busy schedule. We know how valuable your time is, and allowing us to hear your thoughts and feedback, again, as we all try to work together to make the school year as productive and smooth as possible. So thank you again for all your help.